Welcome back. The rain hadn't stopped for hours, turning downtown Hamilton into a blurred watercolor of headlights and glistening pavement. As the courthouse clock struck 9:42 a.m., Leona Grace stepped out of her rideshare, heels slicing through puddles, trench coat billowing behind her like a cape caught in a storm. Her breath rose in faint clouds, mixing with the tension in the air. From the outside, the Hamilton County Courthouse stood stoic, its weather-stained pillars and towering steps projecting the illusion of order. But inside, something volatile simmered. As she approached the entrance, the security guards exchanged quick glances, recognizing her but unsure if they should. Leona didn't break stride. She wasn't here to command attention, but she wasn't here to be overlooked either. She passed through the metal detectors without a word, her eyes scanning the hallway of carved oak panels and marble floors. The scent of old paper, mildew, and brewing coffee clung to the air. Behind courtroom doors, murmurs spilled out. Dockets delayed, verdicts whispered, lives rearranged. This morning was supposed to be simple, a quick appearance to clarify a city zoning mix-up, an error she could have delegated with a phone call. But Leona Grace didn't do convenience, not when something smelled off, and Hamilton's judicial system had reeked for months. She had kept her role under wraps. Governor's legal advisor, former public defender, silent observer to systemic rot. Now she was stepping straight into its epicenter. The doors of Courtroom 3B loomed ahead, carved with the county's motto, "Justice without favor." A bold claim, one she suspected hadn't been honored in years. As she gripped the brass handle and pushed the door open, the courtroom fell abruptly silent. A row of bailiffs stiffened. Judge Barrett Crawley didn't look up right away, but when he did, his eyes narrowed with something between amusement and contempt. Leona's entrance hadn't been expected, but what was about to unfold? No one in that room, least of all the judge, was ready for it. Leona Grace moved through the cavernous hallways of the courthouse like a whisper cutting through stone, every step precise, every glance deliberate. Her navy trench coat, now dried from the storm, hung off one shoulder as she navigated a maze of murmuring clerks, echoing footsteps, and the hum of fluorescent lights that flickered like a warning. She passed framed portraits of past judges, stone-faced men in black robes, their eyes watching her with a kind of silent challenge. But Leona didn't flinch. She had walked halls like this before, first as a rookie public defender taking pro bono cases no one wanted, then as a field investigator on a state commission for judicial ethics. Now, as a legal advisor to the governor, her job was policy, reform, paperwork, but she hadn't come to Hamilton County to shuffle memos. She came for answers, for the patterns no one dared to name, for the stories that never made it past the bench. And at the center of it all was Judge Barrett Crawley. She'd heard the rumors, harsh sentencing for first-time offenders, contempt charges tossed out like candy, lawyers publicly berated until they cracked. Yet nothing ever stuck. No complaints ever made it through. On record, Crawley was spotless, untouchable. But off the record, he was a ghost story whispered through law school corridors, a man who wielded his gavel like a weapon. Leona wanted to see for herself, and more importantly, she wanted the system to see her. In Courtroom 3B, Crawley sat like a king before his court, robed in black, flanked by stone walls and silence. His eyes were hooded, scanning the docket with the weariness of a man who'd stopped seeing people and only saw problems. Across the room, Ella Monroe, Leona's discreet aide, sat in the gallery, her phone angled just right, recording under the pretense of checking emails. Crawley hadn't noticed. Not yet, but he would. Because Leona hadn't come just to settle a zoning citation. She'd come to provoke a response, to catch the judge in the act. Not of some grand corruption, but of the small daily tyrannies that corroded justice from the inside out. Every fiber of her being braced for what came next. She wasn't a rebel. She wasn't looking for war. But as Crawley finally looked up and their eyes locked, the air between them shifted. The tension in the room thickened, like static before a thunderclap. And in that frozen moment, it was clear. He didn't recognize her name, didn't know her face, and most fatally, he didn't see the storm walking straight into his domain. Yet. The moment Leona stepped toward the defendant's podium, the entire room seemed to lean in, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something to snap. Judge Barrett Crawley's gavel struck once, not for order, but for domination. The sound cracked through the silence like a starter pistol, and the game had begun. "Mrs. Grace," he said slowly, dragging out the syllables like he was tasting them. "You're 43 minutes late to my courtroom." His tone was smooth but sharp, like silk wrapped around a dagger. Leona met his gaze, expression calm, shoulders squared. "Your Honor, I was delayed by an urgent conference call with the State Ethics Subcommittee. I don't need your resume," Crawley interrupted, his voice suddenly rising. "I need respect for this bench." He turned to the bailiff, barely disguising a smirk. "Contempt of court, $750. Gasps flickered through the room like sparks. Ella's phone froze on the moment, the red recording light blinking steadily. Leona didn't flinch, but her jaw set just slightly. This wasn't just about her being late. This was something else. Personal, calculated. "Are you fining me for a scheduling conflict tied to a state-level ethics investigation?" she asked, tone cool but direct. "Or are you fining me because I didn't enter crawling?" The gallery tensed. Crawley leaned back in his chair, amused now, but with the kind of cruelty that enjoys the dance before the kill. "You mistake me for someone who gives special treatment, Ms. Grace. In my courtroom, everyone stands equal before the law." "Then let's be equal," she replied. "Let's start by being fair." The room held its breath. Crawley's eyes darkened, lips tightening. He wasn't used to resistance, especially not from someone who knew how to wear power like armor. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in the air. Not from Leona, but from Crawley. Still, a sliver of doubt crept into Leona's mind. Had she miscalculated? Was this man just a bully with a gavel, or something more dangerous? Someone who knew how to turn the rules against anyone who challenged him? Crawley looked down at the docket, pretending to move on, but everyone could feel it. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Leona had poked the bear, and now she could feel his teeth sharpening behind that thin smile. Outside the courtroom, the wind had picked up, howling through the narrow alleys of downtown Hamilton, like a warning no one wanted to hear. Inside, Leona sat in the gallery now, no longer the center of attention, but still a presence that shifted the gravity of the room. Her hands rested lightly on a leather-bound notebook, a pen twirling absently between her fingers, but her eyes, sharp, focused, missed nothing. From behind the judge's bench, Crawley continued presiding like a conductor over a silent symphony of fear. Case after case moved like clockwork, fast and cold, each ruling a hammer dropped without hesitation. A teenage boy with nervous hands was fined for disruption after stumbling over his words. A single mother received no leniency despite a clean record and clear documentation. Something began to tighten in Leona's chest. Not outrage, not yet, but unease. She'd expected arrogance, even hostility. But this was something darker, a pattern. She shifted in her seat, recalling a clerk's offhand comment from weeks ago. "He doesn't yell, he just cuts you off at the knees." And here it was, happening in real time. The blade not seen, only felt in the aftermath. Crawley never raised his voice, but his dismissals carried weight like cement. His sentences, cloaked in procedural jargon, left no room for breath. He didn't need theatrics. His silence was a verdict in itself. Leona's fingers stopped twirling the pen. She began writing. Each name, each ruling, each motion denied without explanation. She wasn't the only one who felt it. The room had started to shift too. The air was thinner, heavier. A few attorneys avoided eye contact with Crawley altogether, lips pressed tight. A junior public defender seated 3 rows ahead leaned over to his client, whispering fast, probably a warning. And then a flicker, a familiar face. A woman in the back, gray suit, hair tied tight, caught Leona's eye and nodded once. Mariah, a former clerk. Leona's stomach dropped. If she was here, if she was watching, it wasn't by accident. Something bigger was unfolding. Leona turned the page and kept writing. The narrative was changing. What started as her fight, her challenge, was unraveling into something systemic, a machine too polished, too practiced. Crawley wasn't reacting emotionally. He was running a program, efficient, ruthless, and disturbingly effective. The worst part, he believed it was justice. And for the first time since walking through those doors, Leona felt something new coil inside her. Not just resolve, but the cold weight of responsibility. This wasn't about her anymore. And whatever she'd thought she was ready for, she wasn't. Not yet. The storm outside had turned violent, thunder cracking like a war drum above the courthouse, as if echoing what was about to explode within its walls. Inside courtroom 3B, the air was stifling, every breath thick with unspoken tension. Crawley sat high on his bench, face stone cold, unaware that the ground beneath him was beginning to fracture. Leona remained still in the gallery, her notebook now closed, fingers laced tightly as she stared ahead, unblinking. Her posture was composed, but inside her pulse pounded like a second heartbeat. She wasn't just witnessing injustice now. She was standing in the middle of it, ankle deep in a flood that could no longer be ignored. Then it happened, a case barely lasting 3 minutes. A young man, barely 22, first offense, no prior record, stood trembling before the bench. Disorderly conduct. His lawyer, nervous but prepared, filed a motion for dismissal due to lack of evidence. Standard, routine. But Crawley didn't even glance at it. Motion denied, he muttered. No explanation, no pause. The defendant lifted his hand timidly. Your Honor, Crawley's gavel struck hard. Another word, and you'll find yourself in contempt. Leona's breath caught. The young man blinked. I didn't even... 30 days in county, Crawley snapped, voice like ice. Let that teach you courtroom discipline. The room went dead silent. Even the walls seemed to recoil. A murmur rippled through the gallery, muffled gasps, attorneys shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Someone dropped a pen. Ella's phone camera zoomed in from her lap. Leona stood, not abruptly, not in protest, just slowly, deliberately, like a lever being pulled. Every eye turned to her. Crawley paused, his eyes narrowing as he recognized her for what she was no longer hiding. Not a random citizen, not a latecomer with a bad excuse, but a witness, a strategist, a reckoning. Leona turned and exited the courtroom without a word, her heels echoing like gunshots on tile. By the time she reached the hallway, her phone had already vibrated, Ella's text blinking on the screen. He did it again. Caught, clear, unjustified. It's all recorded. Leona didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She exhaled slowly, eyes flicking up to the rain-streaked windows. It was done. Crawley had crossed the line, not with rage, but with routine. And this time someone had seen it. Someone had caught it. This wasn't a fight anymore. It was evidence. It was fuel. And as the storm raged outside and Crawley resumed court like nothing had happened, Leona slipped the phone back into her pocket, her footsteps already leading her toward something bigger. The courtroom hadn't just broken trust today, it had exposed itself, and now the mask was off. Rain continued to fall in slow, rhythmic sheets against the windows of Leona's office, painting streaks of light across the floor as the city buzzed restlessly outside. Inside, it was quieter, heavier, like the calm after a battle, but not yet peace. A dozen files lay open across the table, red ink circling names, dates, and rulings. Screens glowed with transcripts, some only partially reviewed, and in the middle of it all sat Leona, hunched slightly, her blazer draped over the back of her chair, sleeves rolled up, hair pulled back like she couldn't afford the distraction. This wasn't over, not even close. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes told the truth. They weren't just tired, they were reckoning with something deeper. Not just the scale of what she'd uncovered, but the weight of how long it had been allowed to exist. She thought she'd known the fight, thought she was prepared. But the truth had been messier than expected, woven into lives, verdicts, careers. She hadn't just exposed Crawley, she'd disturbed a system content with silence. There were victories, yes. Testimonies were piling in. Former clerks and public defenders were stepping out of the shadows, no longer anonymous. One email simply read, I thought no one would ever say it out loud. Thank you, But there were also consequences. The Judicial Review Board had launched a full-scale inquiry, but they weren't thrilled with Leona's method. Back channels buzzed with accusations, overreach, spectacle, political motives. She'd been called everything from a hero to a headline chaser. It stung, not because it hurt her pride, but because it reminded her that truth never arrived without a price. Across from her, Marco leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her with quiet concern. The once jaded attorney who had walked away from courtroom work now stood beside her again, file in hand, sleeves rolled up too. "You didn't start this to win," he said, voice low. "You started it because you couldn't watch it happen again." Leona met his eyes. There was a flicker of vulnerability there. Brief, honest. "I just thought, once it was obvious, it would change. But it's like dragging truth through cement." "Yeah," Marco said. "But it's moving now." He placed a file in front of her. Another case, another name, another shot at making it right. And still, she hesitated. Not because she lacked the will, but because the cost of pushing forward was becoming clear. Favors withdrawn, calls unanswered, allies hesitant. The political world, for all its talk of justice, didn't love those who stirred waters too deep. But then she thought of Lon Vasquez, of the look on his face when Crawley slammed that gavel, of Mariah, the clerk who had sent documents knowing what it could cost her, of the mural they were painting downtown, not of Leona in triumph, but of a woman holding the courtroom door open, a shadow of others behind her, stepping in. So she stood, slowly, stretching her arms, her body aching from sleepless nights and endless calls. She didn't smile, but she didn't break either. "Let's finish what we started," she said, and Marco, without a word, slid the next folder across the table. The fight wasn't over, but neither was she. The hearing room was packed, every seat filled, every breath held. Outside, the line to get in had started before dawn, wrapping around the George L. Hamilton courthouse like a protest in slow motion. Leona Grace entered quietly, no cameras trailing her this time, no entourage, just her and the weight of every voice that had spoken because she dared to first. She took a seat near the back, not as a symbol, not as the face of a movement, but as a witness to what she knew had to happen. The judge presiding over Crawley's judicial conduct hearing adjusted his glasses, the room falling into reverent silence. Then, one by one, the testimonies began. Former clerks read emails never meant for the light of day. Public defenders described rulings that left families broken and careers stalled. A young woman, just 19, choked on her words as she recalled being sentenced for speaking too quickly when she asked for a translator. And then finally Leona stood. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. She spoke not of her own fine, not of the gavel slammed in arrogance, but of a deeper truth. "We do not ask our courts to be perfect. We ask them to be just. And justice doesn't hide behind robes or routines. It reveals itself in how we treat the smallest voices." The silence after her testimony was different. Not shocked, not fearful, but reflective, like a mirror had just been held up to the system and no one could look away. 3 days later, the ruling came down. Judge Crawley removed from the bench permanently, a historic precedent. But Leona didn't hold a press conference. She didn't take a victory lap. Instead, she returned to the community legal center where it all began. There on a brick wall facing the street, artists had finished the mural. Leona standing not in triumph, but at the courthouse door, holding it open with one hand, while the other pointed to a sign overhead. "Justice doesn't need volume, it needs presence." The image went viral within hours. Grace under fire, justice doorway. Even law schools across the country began referencing the case in ethics seminars. A clip of her speech played on repeat on social media, stitched over with testimonies, protest footage, and that quiet moment when she simply walked out of court, back straight, eyes steady. And still, she didn't celebrate, because this was never about taking down a man. It was about lifting up a principle. Accountability isn't revenge. Reform isn't spectacle. And justice? Justice is what happens when people stop whispering and start acting. As the rain cleared and sunlight broke across the courthouse steps, Leona sat inside drafting her next proposal. this time aimed at statewide judicial training, transparency in sentencing, and legal aid expansion. The system had taken a hit, but healing it would take more than headlines. It would take all of us. Because in the end, the real lesson is this: power doesn't corrupt alone. Silence helps it thrive. And the only way to fix the system is to step into it, challenge it, and stay in the fight long after the cameras go dark. If you felt that, if you believe stories like this matter, hit that like button and subscribe to the X Daily Stories channel. We bring you the most gripping, true-to-life stories every day. Stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us that behind every headline is a human heart. Turn on notifications, share this moment, and let your voice be part of the change. Because justice doesn't wait, it listens.